Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Darren, it's been a big day today with the dawn of the age of disclosure. It finally has hit the streaming services, and I purchased it almost as soon as I could today, this morning from Amazon Prime. And started watching that. I got through probably about an hour of it before I had to go run some errands and wasn't able to finish it. Met up with you for pizza, which was awesome. We don't get to do that too much anymore, but you were in town and got to kind of catch up that way, which was wonderful. Then I came home and watched the rest of it, and I've got some first impressions. So this was absolutely one of the best documentaries that has been made on this topic. It is incredibly polished. The hype, I think, was well-deserved. For those of us who've been following along for a number of years now, this really doesn't tread a lot of new territory, but it does carry with it a lot of weight. And so I believe it's going to make a big impact. I think it's already starting to make a big impact, and there are some rippling effects that are occurring in the media and elsewhere. More people, I think, are really going to be stepping forward in the wake of this documentary. I had a lot of mixed feelings with it too. So there's a strong threat narrative that sort of runs throughout the documentary that really, from my personal bias, kind of hits a little too hard. But the kinds of witnesses that are in here, the pedigree, they're incredibly credible witnesses and testimonies. We've got people like Marco Rubio, who doesn't just give a soundbite, but speaks at length in the documentary over various different subjects. Senator Rounds, Gillibrand, Andre Carson, Tim Burchett, Representative Luna, former Representative Gallagher, Jim Clapper, Simi Van. There's just so many names. We get to hear a lot from Jay Stratton, which I think was really welcome, getting his perspective. And there were even several scenes with Jay and Lou together, kind of putting on that unified front, talking about their efforts, their joint efforts with the history of ATIP and the UAPTF. So I found it to be really interesting, really compelling. I think it's going to make a big splash, and I'm excited for those folks who maybe don't know much about this subject to get exposed to it, just to see what their reactions are going to be, because I think it's hard coming into this and hearing these kinds of people talk about it is going to be a little bit hard to digest if you've not been following along over the last several years. But they do a great job of kind of catching people up, walking you through the timeline, 2017, the hearings, the momentum building there, the UAPDA, they talk about that and how it's facing some stiff opposition. They really do a good job of covering a lot of bases here within the time frame. So very excited for it, very excited for kind of what will happen in the wake of this. I'm eager to hear what our listeners think about it. So if you have thoughts, I would love to see what you think in the comments. But Darren, I don't think you've had a chance to watch the whole thing yet, but you did happen to catch Dan Farah's interview with Joe Rogan. So I would love to get your take on that interview, but also I just want to know, what are your feelings on Age of Disclosure? And after we've talked about it, you feel kind of hopeful. What's your thought on the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I think my take is, especially after watching this interview with Dan Farah, that this feels the closest to 2017 that I felt, basically. I have this sense that while it's true that you and I are on the inside, and so it's hard for us to gauge how this is going to land with the public and how much this will move the needle, I think that the sense I get after watching this interview is I do think this is going to have a pretty big impact, and I think it's also going to open the floodgates that many more people will come forward. Farah talked about he's already hearing from people in his DMs and checking their credentials and seeming like they're pretty high-ranking people. They're already reaching out to him. He's talked about Jay Stratton's book is coming out in the spring, says there's some major revelations there. He talked about putting on a full TV series about the life of Jay Stratton, which is very interesting, knowing that prior to a couple of years ago, we hadn't even heard about Jay Stratton, and he kind of came out of nowhere, and now we're really hearing from him quite a bit. So I think that this is going to have a pretty big impact. I think that this will have more of a splash than I initially anticipated. And I think a lot of it has to do with, as we've said before, the kinds of people that are being interviewed, who they are, the credentials they have held or still hold in some cases. For instance, with Marco Rubio, Not only is he Secretary of State, but he's the National Security Advisor currently. This is someone who has access to incredibly sensitive information, even more than he did when he was in the Senate before. So the fact that he's being one of the chief champions of this, and one of the things Farah said in the interview that was interesting was that basically Rubio recognizes that it's going to take something like this to get the movement that's necessary. And it's so real to Rubio that literally Farah said that Rubio had told him this keeps him up at night. Now, in terms of your reference to the threat narrative, he doesn't stay up at night because he's worried about the UAP or the NHI. He's worried about the Chinese actually leapfrogging us because they don't have the same compartmentalization issues we have, the same kind of political roadblocks. So you and I were talking about this before we started recording. There is the issue of NHI, UAP, the long history of the 80 years. We're also tonight going to talk about all the deeper ramifications and where this goes beyond kind of the surface level. But one of the really important implications that's arisen and was clear in that interview with Farah on Joe Rogan is that there definitely is a Cold War. There's a race underway right now. And it may be, and apparently some people within the U.S. administration are concerned that the Chinese are already ahead. And again, just the nature of how they can get things done, how they can be all guns a-blazing, all pistons firing succinctly, suggests that they could make some sort of breakthrough. And as I was saying to you a few minutes ago, it occurs to me that they may decide we have a window right now where we've got a grip on some new aspect of this technology that the U.S. doesn't seem to have quite yet. Do we want to wait 5 years until they might have it? Or might we try to strike right now, gain some sort of global dominance in light of the technology we have? I think this is actually a real concern. And David Grush and people talked about this, that part of the revelation here is that there has been an ongoing Cold War. I think some people think that's maybe hype, but what I heard from Farah and what he was referencing that basically Marco Rubio had said, I think this is a real concern. And on top of that, I want to say one more thing and pass it back to you. There is this strong sense, and Farah gave his take on it. He asked Joe Rogan about his take, and that's around whether or not Donald Trump might end up being the disclosure president, might end up being the person who literally goes to a podium and makes an announcement. Now, you shared with me over lunch today when we had pizza that one of the most poignant moments in the movie is when there is the sense that under Trump 1, under the first administration, there was basically a conversation being had about trying to investigate the ramifications for the financial markets if there were some sort of statement from a podium, which basically implies this was at least planned as one possibility. And in light of what's happened now, in light of what we just saw with the quick about face with the Epstein file, first saying no and then finally bowing to public pressure, I would say it's now 50-50 whether or not Trump might actually be the first president in history to go and make some sort of statement from a podium. Is it going to be largely ego-driven? Yes. Is it possible that the people like David Grush going on Fox News and suggesting that Trump might achieve greatness by doing this, might he be stoking that ego to try to encourage this to happen? Absolutely. I think it's all very calculated. But nevertheless, we're in uncharted territory. And as much as you and I have sometimes talked about the ebb and flow of the disclosure movement and what we've been in since 2017, it feels like things are heating up and we might just be on the precipice of something pretty consequential. But I want to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, it's a weird time to be alive on so many fronts, and to imagine that Donald Trump would be the disclosure president is truly interesting. One thing that I think he probably grapples with beyond whatever he may or may not know about the depth of our involvement with UAP, but you kind of touched on the ego component there. And one thing I don't think he would like is that this topic, once disclosed, would really take the attention. It would take all of the attention. And you kind of saw this a little bit with the pandemic. When COVID happened, Trump had to sort of play second fiddle to folks like Fauci, who had to be kind of the experts behind the podium and talk about what they knew, talk about what we should be doing. And that's not something he likes. I mean, he wants to be in the spotlight. He wants to be in control, wants to be in command of the situation. And so once you sort of acknowledge that we've been doing this, that there's been this Cold War, we have this technology, we're studying it. I mean, we've talked about this so many times on the show. The number of questions which follow a pronouncement like that, does he have the capacity, the ability to be able to address those? Is he going to want to address those? Or is it just sort of like, well, we told you we're not alone. Don't worry, folks, we are working on it, and just go back to your 9 to 5 and, keep putting money into your 401k. Like it's a really weird scenario, honestly. And I think that's why, we've talked about before that when you had folks like Hal Puthoff during, I think, the Reagan administration, or sorry, I think this was the George W. Bush administration, study the ramifications of disclosure, why they kind of sided on maybe not doing that. It's the fuse, when you light this thing, that it's real. There's so many things that follow from that acknowledgement that are really chaotic, I think, to control. And so, yes, I do think that we're close. I think for me, the kind of disclosure we can expect is that we're not alone, that we have been visited. And that's kind of the extent of what we're going to know, that our top scientists are studying this, and we have been studying it, and whatever advancements we can gain, we'll share with the public, and obviously national security, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think we're going to go into a lot of the, darker elements here, but they certainly will follow. And so it's going to be really interesting how that is managed. And of course, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? According to the wise Mike Tyson. So we'll have to see, what kind of plans they think they have and what happens when they actually do make that kind of announcement, if in fact they do. So time will tell. We shall see.
Yeah, something else that's interesting too is that in light of the interview I just saw with Farah, a couple things. One is the discussion of NHI. So this is interesting that we are not just getting discussion about the craft and the technology and what's behind the propulsion and things like that, but we're also hearing discussion about the beings themselves. We know that Eric Davis has been more outspoken about that recently. He did that in front of a congressional group a few months ago. But this came up again, that Farah said he'd spoke to many people who had seen at least 4 different species. And he also talked about basically the understanding on the inside is that the universe is teeming with life. Not just that we found an outlier and it turns out we're not alone, there's one more, but actually the universe is teeming with life. And on top of that, there is a sense that there are different agendas. And this is something you and I have addressed many times on this podcast. You get the full gamut in terms of very benevolent beings, as well as some that might be more self-serving. The other thing that came up that I thought was really interesting was he was claiming that the understanding is that not only has there been a reverse engineering program going back decades now, but that it has made significant strides. So, we think about how in the past this has been questioned, how much progress had actually been made. He says that quite a bit of progress has been made. And this, of course, partly muddies the waters because it means that some of the UAP people are seeing are actually probably US-owned or Chinese-owned or Russian-owned. And when Joe Rogan was pressing him on just how functioning is this kind of technology, like what can it do, he mentioned that, well, it basically can be in space. And when Rogan pressed him and said, do you mean like low Earth orbit, or do you mean like moving through the solar system kind of thing, like visiting other planets? And Farah said he's been told by high-ranking individuals that he means traveling to other planets. So this, of course, again, highlights not just the capabilities, but the degree of the gatekeeping up until now. Because we think about how little progress there's been, apparently anyway, since the moon landings, right? We think about the massive breakthroughs happening in the 1960s with the Apollo program and whatnot. And ever since the Challenger disaster and whatnot, there hasn't been much progress made, at least superficially. You have to ask yourself, does that seem likely? And this is something you and I have talked about before, that not only has there been gatekeeping going on, but there might have been even trying to get scientists and people in industry to bark up the wrong tree, while some other group, either privately or some branch of the government or some offshoot of the government that's not under congressional control, might be developing technology that is eons ahead of what we're talking about. He brought up 0-point energy. He talked about if you could deliver a nuclear weapon in something like a Tic Tac that can drop from space basically to ground level in less than a second, then you can deliver a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world largely instantaneously. Changes everything, makes all the old defense mechanisms completely irrelevant and outdated. So these are consequential things. And again, I think part of what this comes down to when we think about managed disclosure versus catastrophic disclosure. This is interesting because I heard a friend of ours, James Iandoli, talking about this recently, making the point that catastrophic disclosure was not really about finding out that NHI are real. It's finding out that the gatekeeping has existed like it has for the last 80 years. It's the cover-up that is the thing that's catastrophic. I think that's an open question. But nevertheless, I think we're at a really interesting turning point, because something I'd like to bring up now and get your take on as well is, in addition to us being on the day of the release of this film, we also recently have had legislation for the third time failed to be taken up by Congress that was championed by people like Carl Nell, that was meant to basically be the infrastructure for this controlled disclosure. That's interesting in itself, and you might even ask, I think fairly so at this point, might that have been a miscalculation? Because 3 years we tried this and it didn't work. And so this puts even, in some ways, more pressure on this film, because it's going to take something like this to gain purchase for us to get some sort of path forward. Because one of the things I've talked about before with you on this show is that if that legislation didn't pass, it wasn't clear what the path forward was. Well, maybe this is it. Maybe this creates enough pressure, a la the Epstein files, that maybe this does get congressional movement and might get things moving. So what's your take on that in terms of the timing of this film, in light of we've just come out of the fact that this legislation for a third time failed to pass?
Well, I do think it's certainly possible, and I believe that because, in part, for a couple of reasons. So one, the film was recently screened for members of Congress. I don't know how many were in attendance, but certainly a good number saw the film. And what we've seen from congressional representatives who've had exposure to this topic is we've not seen a decreasing level of interest. So if you get them exposed and you get them introduced to the kinds of witnesses and their colleagues who are also involved and happen to know more about it, the interest only goes up, right? And so then eventually, I think you can get to this place where there's a bipartisan effort, which is something that everybody likes to champion. We had a bipartisan bill here. Like, people love to be able to say that. And if you've got your holdouts who are in the back pocket of some of these defense contractors or whatnot, and they're not they're putting up the roadblocks to getting this passed, it does begin to have that Epstein-esque kind of situation where it's like, wait a minute, why would you want to protect this guy? Why would you want to? Doesn't everybody want to know more about this? And so, why would you be the roadblock here? So I think the pressure may be more than those holdouts can withstand. And so eventually we may see some real genuine progress on it. I did see there was a post on X from Burleson through Matt Laszlo that there was going to be another attempt to try to reintroduce something like the UAPDA in the near term. So we shall see. Congress certainly isn't the most functional organization, as we've all known, because of the shutdown in the last few weeks. So it remains to be seen on how soon we get some progress on this. But the lawmakers who are engaged, they seem very engaged and passionate even. You've got statements in this film that are really full of conviction. Andre Carson saying, I think the American people are ready to know the truth, are ready to handle the truth. And that's a big statement to put out there, right? So I'm encouraged. I'm excited. It's going to be some, guarantee there's going to be some strange territory to navigate here. So it may not come out as quickly as we like. But I'm always been a proponent of the compounding effect of this, right? So if you look at the scope of where we've been since 2017 and that recent resurgence of interest, there was this strong need to get the media involved, to get Congress's attention, to get Congress to focus on getting the Department of Defense and the agencies to sort of divulge what they have. We're finally getting that kind of momentum. We're hitting the roadblocks, but now we're at the congressional level of interest. And now the public will have that same level of introduction. And so, if you've been with this for a while, you might continue to be frustrated that the conversation isn't going as fast as you might like. But I think it is the unfolding of this subject as it has to go. So 2026, as I've been saying for many months to friends, is going to be a wild ride. I'm pretty convinced of that. Will it contain disclosure? I don't know. But like you, I feel like we are kind of have the best chance that we've had in several years at this point.
Yeah, agreed. And something else I wanted to touch on that relates to the technology component and how game-changing this is, because in a moment we're going to stretch beyond the technology and get to the deeper implications that ultimately end at the nature of reality. Before we go there were a couple things that came up with the interview that I thought were interesting, and Farah was sharing things he's heard off the record and things that didn't make it into the film. And one of the things he talked about was the regular occurrence of these orbs. So it's interesting because back to 2017, if you think back to then, that wasn't really so much in the discussion. But over the last few years, spheres and orbs have been front and center, right? And even notion of plasma, this notion now, about this system that might be up in satellite kind of range and examining human civilization going back decades and decades before we had satellites up, basically. Some sort of like surveillance system that's been here all along, perhaps, that is represented in these spheres and these orbs. But something else that was brought up that's really interesting, and it struck me because of how much it actually goes against the grain of all the sci-fi films we've seen across time. Because when we see sci-fi films like Independence Day or War of the Worlds or something, these big machines or these big crafts suddenly appear in the sky and everyone screams and wonder what's going on kind of thing. Even Arrival, which was a much more thoughtful kind of film, also has this arrival of these giant ships that are just sitting there in midair kind of thing, hovering. But one point that Farah made is that the key here is space-time bubbles. The key here is space-time distortion. The key here is technology that can work at the level of manipulation of space-time, of the fabric of our apparent reality, in other words. And this, of course, goes to the nature of the propulsion systems. But the reason why this is consequential in addition to propulsion systems is that, for instance, when you warp space-time, and this relates to something I talked about in the most recent POC episode, because space-time is one integrated fabric, it's not just that you can time travel, which you can. It's not just that you could move really quickly, which you could. But it's also that you can represent space differently relative to another space-time frame. So in that sense, when we see an orb, we have to realize that might not actually represent an orb within its own space-time. One thing I was saying to you a few minutes ago, it could literally be a mothership that's enfolded into the shape and the size of a golf ball in our reference point. And this, of course, comports with part of the lore where people often see a certain craft that's not very big in their backyard. They go inside and it's the size of a football field. For a long time, people thought, that's strange. Is that part of the high strangeness? What does that mean? It's actually not that highly strange. It's actually a consequence of when you can warp space-time. You can represent or wrap or enfold a certain kind of space-time context and represent it differently in another one. So he mentioned, Farah did, several ways this would apply. He talked about the kids in Zimbabwe at the aerial school that saw the beings that looked like they were moving in slow motion. And he brought up the point that if you're looking from one relative space-time into another relative space-time, then you're going to see strange representations like that. And this would relate to, for instance, when you've seen someone who's in a pool and their head is above the water and the rest of the body is below the water. And you get this funny effect sometimes where it looks like their body is 6 feet away from their head because of that. It's sort of like that. You're looking into this distortion field, basically, which, by the way, also explains why so often the pictures are blurry. He also talked about how radar will go right around that bubble because it's only referencing our space-time. Even when we see something that zooms off at what looks like 10,000 miles an hour, might actually just be the way it looks to us relative to the fact that they're in their own space-time bubble. And on top of that, you've got things like transmedium travel, where you can not only go from space to sea back up into the air, but you can literally move through physical objects. And Rogan brought up a case where someone literally saw something manifest and just move right through trees. Like it didn't have to go around the trees, just went right through them. Of course, this also fits with so many of the abductions where they come right through the wall. I think about even what happened with me in the hotel in 2005, the being disappeared through the wall. Once you start recognizing, as Hal Puthoff has pointed out, and this is something that Lou Elizondo's talked about, once you have this one capability then it changes propulsion, it changes energy systems, it changes how you relate with reality, it changes your relationship with space-time. All of this is wrapped up in this. And the last thing I want to say, and then get your take too, which is interesting, is that I thought Rogan actually asked a pretty insightful question. He asked if there was a range or a gradient of kinds of technology that have been recovered, like maybe some beings are further ahead than others. And basically, Ferris said, no, this space-time warping kind of technology and mechanism of propulsion seems to be ubiquitous with the phenomenon, which again raises questions. Are some of these different beings, even though they look different, maybe all somehow related in some ways? We don't know. But I'm curious to get your take on that, because we're going to get into some stuff with the occult and religious history and the nature of reality. But just in terms of a nuts and bolts kind of perspective, this technology is game-changing and answers many questions that have been open-ended within the lore for quite some time.
It does, and it is one lens by which you can view the entire thing. And obviously, we are going to get into some of that greater complexity. And so I think I kind of sympathize with folks in the community that get frustrated with some of the voices in this documentary and say, hey, this is coming from a very particular perspective. It's really hyping the threat narrative. Consider the source, and they may be managing the narrative in terms of what they want you to think about the phenomenon, and maybe something else entirely. I think there is some truth to that. I really do. But I also think that it is a part of the entire thing. So we can't just discount it outright and say, oh, it came from, the biggest spokesperson on this is Elizondo, or it came from Hal Puthoff, and therefore, I'm just going to throw that out entirely. I think we have to take it seriously, and I think it represents one piece of a larger puzzle, and the technology certainly is a game-changing element. But as they talk about in the documentary, and Hal Puthoff kind of puts this really succinctly, is that, while we've made all these incredible advances in our technology, we've not made similar advances in our ability to get along with each other. So it is this real paradox here that if humanity cracks this amazing power, just like we cracked the ability to split the atom, how is that going to transform the society that we live in? Because it may no longer be a situation where, hey, we have some anti-grav and you have anti-grav, and we'll just kind of point those weapons at each other. I mean, the real instant annihilation kind of threat power to this may cause us to say, look, I mean, conventional warfare and, really hurting each other the way we've been hurt, it's just not going to be the way we can move forward. And, part of it as well is a resource war, right? So if you change the game entirely by removing the need for fossil fuels or the need for some of these rare earth minerals or whatever it is, and you can now hop in a spacecraft or whatever and go to another planet, and there's more space just generally for humanity to move into. Perhaps some of these squabbles are really, they're just not going to be as significant as they used to be. So I don't know. I'm hopeful. I really hope that we can kind of put our differences behind us and turn a page to a new chapter. But we've got a lot of work to do on that front, as you know.
Yeah, well said. And I think I'm thinking here of something that, again, Farah brought up in light of Hal Puthoff, and something he had said about the George Bush, the first administration, when they actually basically held a forum of experts to see if they thought disclosure should happen or not. And we've talked about that on this podcast before, where basically all these experts were brought into a room. They weren't told whether or not this was an actual exercise or it was just basically a thought exercise. But they basically were told that, say, for instance, there is evidence that we are in contact with other kinds of beings who have advanced technology and whatnot. Do you think, in light of the interconnected nature of the modern world with economics and resources and energy and all these things, geopolitics, do you think it would be a net positive for humanity to learn about this right now? And Hal Puthoff has spoken about this, and he said that basically every single table came to the conclusion, nay, that they don't think we should say anything because the net would be negative, actually, which is really interesting. I think many people have been frustrated with Puthoff, knowing that that was the case, that we were that close even that many years ago. But interestingly, Ferris said that now when he speaks to Puthoff, he has a different tale. He actually says that, yes, it's always a risk that when we talk about this, it could turn into a quickly escalating war that, as to your point, with 0 point energy, if you weaponize that, you could just annihilate local space-time altogether, right? It makes ironically nuclear weapons look like children's toys. But on the flip side, the abundance potentially would be so massive that you might, just maybe, help humanity transcend beyond the kind of resource war based on the illusion of scarcity that I also talk about. This might help us transcend that, especially maybe if we had some gatekeepers that came down in terms of the NHI that might help us make that transition. But he's saying basically, this is a put off here. He thinks it's worth the gamble to announce this to the world, release some of the technology, make some of these leaps, get our best thinkers, get the next generation of scientists working on this. We might be able to put aside our squabbles in light of the abundance that would come out of that. So I think that's a truly fascinating situation to be in. And I think many of us sometimes wonder, what is the worst case scenario here? Because on the one hand, it feels like the world is always on the brink recently, right? We're right on the precipice of self-destruction. On the one hand, I can completely understand that, if you had a terrorist organization that got a hold of 0-point energy, it could be game over, literally. On the other hand, maybe when these different nations around the world and the incredible inequalities we have in the world suddenly is addressable because of technology and just the amount of enthusiasm that might suddenly arise. We've never seen something like that in the history of our civilization. All right, with all that said, we covered a lot there. And this is all within the sort of technology range, right? Now, you and I both know, though, that this stretches beyond technology. One way I do want to talk about how this stretches, by the way, is later on we're going to talk about the overlap or the intersection with religious history. Now, one thing even Farah brought up that has been brought up by people he spoke to is that he said, for sure, there was a crash at Roswell. There were beings that were recovered. And on top of that, he said there were hieroglyphics on the craft that was recovered at Roswell, which, of course, harkens back to notions of the Watchers and the Book of Enoch and the notion of hybrids that were happening then, right alongside the hybridization project that happened more recently and might still be happening. So there's many ways this goes, but let's maybe step through this one step at a time into an ever steepening kind of curve in terms of the implications, the consequences for reality, because this is something we discussed over pizza today. The challenge is what we're about to discover, or what is discoverable beyond what is recognized so far in our modern society, is so much larger than what we already understand as the nature of reality, that it's kind of a misnomer when we talk about adding the phenomenon to our current understanding. Because really we need to fit our current understanding within this much larger context, which is the majority of what actually is. So it's kind of like when we talk about dark energy or dark matter, and they're like, yeah, we understand everything about the cosmos, and most of it's dark energy and dark matter. And then you ask them, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, we don't really know what that is, but the vast majority of it is missing, so we just call it this thing, dark matter and dark energy. The phenomenon's kind of like that. It's this dark phenomenon. I don't mean dark in terms of negative. I just mean it's dark in terms of we have no light on it other than the high strangeness and all the stories that come down through the lore. So that said, to me, this kind of brings to mind the analogy of when you've got people with blindfolds touching an elephant at different places, right, and reporting back in terms of what they find. One person strokes the trunk and says, it's like this. Somebody else is down by this big foot and they're saying it's like this. Somebody else has got an eyeball and they're like, it's smooth and kind of glossy. And of course, the point is that's all the elephant, but it's people in all different points of the elephant. And so the challenge with the phenomenon is that people, kind of out of narrative laziness, and also just because we're used to things fitting into fairly small categories, want to know what it is in a paragraph, please, or at most an essay. But again, there's more to reality that is undiscovered than has been discovered thus far. And really, when we say the phenomenon, that's what we literally mean. So let's walk this through step by step, beginning with nuts and bolts. And I'm curious to ask you, Nathan, as we do each of these steps and get into the ever more consequential and disorienting parts of the phenomenon, I would like for each of us to reflect back to what it was like for us in our own personal journey when we went into these deeper levels, when we discovered through our own journey, to your point, that people in the public are now going to have to go through the same journey we've gone through. Think back, if you will, to when you began to recognize there was a nuts and bolts technology thing here that could be revolutionary. What was that like when you initially understood that? And at what point, if you can think back, did you begin to glean that there's more than technology on the table here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly remember when the Tic Tac story broke and feeling this sense of excitement at the possibility of this technology, at the possibility of the reality of aliens and spacecraft and saucers and who knows what incredible insights and discoveries that they would be able to share with humanity. And it was really all about the expansion of the mastery of the material world. You know, what more can we do that can give us domination over matter, over biology, all this sort of physical stuff. And I remember really to be honest, through conversations with you in those earlier days, where you were introducing me to concepts of idealism. And I was excited by that too, but also kind of like, oh, wait, I got to pick this stuff up again. And by this stuff, I mean the kind of philosophical, theological, metaphysical content that I grew up in and was steeped in and thinking about in my younger years and in my days at seminary, exploring these different ontological models of God, perceptions of that, and then coming to this place in my early 20s of saying, I don't really believe in that stuff anymore. These are just sort of fun stories we tell ourselves to cope with the difficulty of reality and the inevitability of our deaths, right? So this very glum kind of perspective. And so after going through the nuts and bolts, excitement, and then getting introduced to these metaphysical frameworks that could incorporate the phenomenon, aspects of it that are reported, it was me kind of coming to terms with this part of myself that I kind of threw away. So it's like picking it back up again and saying, wait a minute, hey, did you need to throw this away? Maybe this is actually still really, really valuable. And lo and behold, it has been, and it's become really the most meaningful part of this journey for me beyond the nuts and bolts, is to reclaim that capacity to think about the greater meaning of ultimate reality and our relationship to each other and our relationship to source and all these sorts of things that I know can be frustrating for people because they feel a little bit less tangible. But for me personally, they feel to be the most relevant, most important, most impactful aspects of my own lived experience.
Yeah, very much my experience as well. And my journey has been different than yours, but similar in the sense that some aspects of what was central to my life decades ago actually came front and center again through the UFO phenomenon, which I never expected at all. Okay, so let's walk this through in a couple different steps here before we get to like the ultimate nature of reality and reality models and things like that. So stage one that a lot of people are going to be introduced to with this film is the nuts and bolts framing. So here the focus is on sightings, videos, physical craft. That becomes an open question. What does physical mean? Propulsion systems, military programs, crash retrievals, reverse engineering. Like you said, there's definitely a sense of a threat narrative with this film. Of course, one of the things that you and I talked about that I think we do need to talk about is who is the audience for this film. And while it's, yes, partly the American public, I would argue, and I think you would argue as well, that it's the American public meant to be used as leverage to pressure lawmakers to move on this. So basically, it's, again, the way forward, the next way forward, perhaps after the failure of the legislation, to try to get movement on this so that disclosure can happen. Now, that's going to be focused mainly on nuts and bolts, and it's also going to be framed in terms of threat, because then you're going to get congressional movement. This is something you and I talked about in the early liminal frames. There's a difference between potential threat and actual threat. And we argued back then that people like Elizondo and Mellon were making the case for a potential threat, because then Congress is behooved basically to take action as part of their constitutional oath. So I do want to make that point to people. I do think, on the one hand, that there is too much threat narrative discussion. At the same time, I think that's a means to an end in the mind of some of these people, including people like Rubio probably as well. So the questions at this physical level are they real? Are they physical vehicles? What governments know what? It assumes largely extraterrestrial beings. It assumes they're biological, and it assumes the notion of technologically advanced civilizations. So all of that's brought up in this film, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, most people seeing this film for the first time who are not very familiar with this topic are going to land at stage one, absolutely. But let me move on to stage two and get your take on that, because then it stretches out a little bit further. The implications are a bit more consequential. Stage two is the socio-political and civilization-wide implications. So beyond craft and propulsion systems and NHI that are largely ETs in people's minds, we move into the notion of secret programs, even potentially breakaway civilizations. I want us to talk about why people go there. Why is that part of the lore? And excessive compartmentalization. We also learn about the notion of treaties and accords. We think here about David Grush between NHI and human groups. So now it's not just this notion of this out there thing that might exist, but there's this notion that it's real, it's nuts and bolts, it's here, and that even there's been contact and communication between human governments and these NHI potentially. And we think about the effects on geopolitics, disclosure, religion, economics, governance, something we talked about before with that forum that Hal Puthoff was involved in. So now let's go to that stage, right? Think about the stage two implications. Tell me about what that was like for you when you started recognizing, okay, this is going to be a lot more than a discussion around how we incorporate this new technology and say, okay, check, yes, there's other life in the universe. But all these other things to do with the socio-political implications, the secrecy programs, even the understanding of to what degree are we actually operating under a true democracy.
I mean, it's an incredibly destabilizing component to dwell in. And I think everybody needs to spend some time really sitting with this, because if you've ever had that sense in which things just don't seem right, something seems a little bit out of place. And I think in the 21st century, we probably all share this unease to a certain degree of the society that we've created for ourselves, because we on the one hand acknowledge that we are being marketed to, that we are being managed in our perception and sold a lot of things, and our behavior is really largely trying to be orchestrated, right? So we kind of get that, but at the same time, we're willing participants in the entire enterprise. So we're sort of happy to be led down these paths, while at the same time feeling deep down inside of us that something is wrong about that. And I think what is challenging there is what exactly is wrong. And so when we're getting to this layer of the component of, hey, were there agreements with NHI? Were there agreements to have high secrecy around these, world-changing technologies and revelations? What lengths did those governments and extra-governmental organizations go to maintain the secrecy? What charades did they put on to kind of get humanity to continue to do its thing the way that it's been doing, all the while behind the scenes behaving in perhaps entirely different ways? And I think if you explore those possibilities, you can't help but feel a sense of both betrayal and incredible frustration and anger, right? Like, how could we do this to ourselves? And I think if you're a rational kind of thinking adult person, you can probably come up with some justifications as to why states may act in the way that they may have acted here, but that doesn't necessarily make it right. And so there's a sense in which we have to, in this layer, there's a need in which we need to cleanse ourselves of this problem that we've created. And so what this disclosure represents for us is kind of this opportunity to transform and move into a more transparent reality where we're participating in greater knowledge of what reality truly is. And of course, how much can we really know? We'll continue to explore that as we go through these different layers. But that's sort of the big picture for me is obviously it's going to be incredibly transformative in cultural ways, and not just from an anthropological perspective, but the new dynamic, sort of an exoanthropology, as we relate with them and they with us in an explicit way, right? So there may have been all kinds of hidden secret relationships that we just know nothing about, but this more overt, more explicit dynamic is really going to be fascinating to study.
Yeah, and I think about, in light of that, something that Farah said as well in talking about different contact that has happened between government groups and these different NHI. And he talked about one that was particularly impacting for him, where there was this one being that was recovered that was slowly dying. And telepathically, this being communicated to this one official in kind of a sorrowful way that humankind has really lost its way and has lost its understanding of its connection to the whole. This is something I talk about a lot. We've talked about on this podcast as well. But this is consequential for this particular stage 2, sociopolitical and civilization-wide implications, because it's not just the nature of this technology and the game changer it can be, but it's also in what context is that technology received. And the challenge is when you receive this in a civilization that is still largely operating under the illusion of separation, under the illusion of scarcity, where it's about what can I get, and if I get it, someone else doesn't get it because there's only so much to go around. The challenge is when you have incremental change, then you can kind of incorporate it into the society, and the society is kind of built to do that. We talk about, for instance, when you brought up COVID a little while ago, in a lot of ways, our modern society, capitalist-driven society, is not built to sustain months and months and months of no economic activity. It's just not built for that. And yet we had to sort of come up with some sort of solution when that happened. Now, in a similar way, I think about when technology comes online that's incremental, you can incorporate it through the system, you put it through R&D, and you eventually release it to different industry, and it slowly gets used by society. But what happens when you get suddenly, in one fell swoop, completely game-changing technology that suddenly lets you leap eons ahead and makes all of the concerns of finitude go away in one fell swoop? We have really no mechanism for that, of course. But this is the point about 0 point or the space-time kind of warping, the fracturing, the engineering can happen to space-time itself. It basically makes all of these concerns about scarcity go completely away. And when you can literally move about in space and time in any way you want, then it changes everything. So this is why we end up with this notion of a breakaway civilization. And that's because the idea here is that the sudden influx of technology was so game-changing that some groups said, we don't need to raise money. We don't need to go to Congress and say we need another few trillion. We will just generate all of this through this technology we have. We might even, to your point before about we could travel to different planets, we might be able to split off an alternate space-time or go to an alternate version of the Earth. And who knows, dig up gold or oil there and sell it back on the market and use it. Whatever way. They might not even have to do that at that point. That's the point. So the notion here is that if you suddenly stumbled across technology that puts you thousands of years ahead, potentially, not just dozens, not decades, not even a century, then it might actually lead to something like a breakaway civilization. And then this leads to what we've heard from people like Matthew Brown about us living in a controlled reality, the sense that this is kind of like the Matrix, that you could even perhaps put the hood over the entire civilization through the way you control space-time. And to your point before about how we get this nagging sense that something's wrong, in addition to that nagging intuitive sense that I think most people have, there also is when you start connecting the dots, putting the puzzle pieces together in terms of what I said before, just the lack of progress in the space program, the seemingly roadblock we've had in physics development, right, that people have talked about before. While what might have happened going back again to the middle part of the 20th century was some sort of 0 point or gravitic kind of technology that changed everything. And the part, to your point about the rage and the anger and just the pain that is involved there is the sense that perhaps some of our own at some point could have given this gift to the planet and changed everything, solved diseases, made cancer something that's only from ancient times, could have solved all of our energy issues, could have helped alleviate global warming before it ever became a really big thing. And to think that some group actually said, no thanks, we'll keep this for ourselves, and the rest of you will suffer in the Stone Age, basically, in comparison. And on top of that, we're going to force you into that by deceiving you about the nature of reality. That is catastrophic disclosure, right? If that's what this is really about. And yet it might be to that level. So that's the challenge here is, again, how much can be stomached when we talk about even some sort of amnesty that was talked about in this interview, like that might be necessary for this to happen. But man alive, I think some of what has happened has been truly, truly horrific, and it's going to be hard to get past that no matter what. All right, let me move on to stage 3 and get your take on this, because we've got a few stages to get to yet. So stage 3, in terms of the deeper consequential elements of the phenomenon, has to now do with interdimensional notions and metaphysical models, which you referenced a little while ago. So now we suddenly are in the territory of nonlinear time, extra-dimensional entities in addition to just extraterrestrial, and even parallel timelines that I just spoke about in terms of space-time engineering. And, of course, interaction with psi phenomena. When you and I first got into this in 2017, that wasn't so much of the conversation. By the time we got to Lou Elizondo, learning that he himself was a remote viewer, kind of trained in these things. And, Dan Farrow brought this up today. It's no accident that people like Hal Puthoff have been at the center of the UFO phenomenon and that research, but have also been at the center of the psi phenomena and remote viewing programs with the CIA and that kind of thing. So that suddenly gets in here, right? When we talk about the phenomenon, we also mean something that is about interior now rather than the exterior technology, a kind of interior consciousness-driven technology. And in addition, the sense that these encounters are partly non-physical or cross-perceptual. So again, now we get into the notion of the ontology of the experiences themselves. So reflect, if you will, on when that opened up into part of the conversation for you.
Oh boy, yeah, this is a big one. It just like I alluded to with that reclaiming of what I had thrown away with my theological education, this really did a number on some of the aspects of the theological education that I, even at the time I was in seminary, didn't really believe in. And here I'm talking about, prophetic visions, angels, interactions with, these deity type beings in the scriptures, miracles. These were things that as a kind of 20th century, 21st century human being, like I just sort of thought were cute little mythologies that, helped the early church package this information and tell the story, right? But now I had to look at those through a whole different lens and say, wait a minute, maybe these in fact were real experiences. And so it threw into question for me the kind of hubris that I brought to that relationship, thinking that these ancient people must be so stupid. They must not be very bright. They must not be like us who are so enlightened. And, we've got all these incredible insights, and look at kind of the two sticks they were rubbing together back then to try to make sense of the world. And I feel like that is so uncharitable to our forebears. And so it really helped me to reclaim, at least open up more space for the possibility of those encounters being genuine and those experiences being genuine. I think we have, as you and I have talked about before many times, we have really an inadequate lexicon for a lot of these experiences, these aspects of reality that do interface with our more materialist model, right? So when we bump into these things, we tend to brush them off right away. We write them off as sort of illusions, imaginal, hysterical, you've lost your mind kind of things, when in reality they could be part and parcel to just the lived experience. And so we've cut off a bit of ourselves by saying no to those experiences and saying no to loved ones who come to us looking for someone to acknowledge that they're sane, and saying, sorry, yeah, I don't really buy into that. I think you're crazy. How sad is that? So this does, I think, raise a lot of interesting questions and causes us to wrestle with the model of the world we've inherited. And you use the word interdimensional. That word is used quite a lot, used in the documentary, in fact, as well. And I think it is to some degree kind of a placeholder for just this aspect of the reality that we're totally unfamiliar with. And when you talk about space-time engineering and all these kinds of breakaway civilizations, when you open the door to that possibility, the real sort of outcome of that is kind of infinite. It's a mash of so many possibilities that intersect with one another across different timelines, etc. That I think everything under the sun is certainly possible when that becomes part of the equation, and that may be part of the development, right? So we've talked about that, and we'll probably continue to talk about that some on this episode. What does unlocking each of these levels sort of imply next about the nature of reality itself? So, those are my initial thoughts on it, and I'm grateful to have gone through that examination, and I'm still going through it. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. I have not had an experience that I think people would recognize as a classical experience, but I've had experiences that fall into kind of sort of experiences that I certainly put a lot of weight behind and tend to think are more important than I used to.
Yeah, and I think about that in a couple different ways. It's interesting in how this overlaps here, because I'm thinking about when I brought to your attention this book that my friend Jeff Kreppel brought to my attention. And it's this book, I think you've read it since then. It's called They Flew, A History of the Impossible by Carlos Ayer. And what's interesting about this book is that it basically is claiming that these ancient religious people, nuns and whatnot, could literally levitate or fly, literally take off somehow. And of course, in a physicalist kind of framework, this makes no sense. It's impossible, right? Hence the subtitle there. But what's interesting is thinking about how you and I embrace that book now in light of what we learned about the phenomenon versus how we might have looked at that at the time that you were in seminary, when I was in my religious studies. I mean, it's interesting because, to your point, when we were both in those circles, no one was talking to us about the intersection with the UFO phenomenon and the possibility that this was part of some subsuming realm that was still interacting with us today. No one was saying the Book of Enoch is actually related to what's happening with the modern UFO phenomenon. I don't remember any classes where that was offered. I think I probably would have taken it if it was. So it's interesting now realizing that because of what we know about the phenomenon and all the experiences of modern experiencers, suddenly the notion that nuns 4 or 5 centuries ago sometimes flew and levitated, and sometimes literally kind of humorously would have their other sisters hold them down for fear that they're about to take off. Like, it's a funny notion. And yet it's true, right? And again, if you start getting into a post-physicalist, post-materialist kind of understanding of reality, it's not at all strange. That's the part, is it changes how you define what is strange even. So I definitely think about this. And something I was going to bring up in terms of this funny overlap is that when you talk about not having had experiences personally yet, what's interesting is that also even applies in the difference between our experience with Christianity historically. Because in the circles you were in, it was quite intellectual, quite cerebral. It was sort of boiled down into how should we live our lives in light of these implications, right? It was very ethical, humanistic kind of expression based on the teachings and the implications of the teachings. Well, in the circles I was in, when I think both about Eastern Orthodoxy and also when I was in my Pentecostal circles, there literally was a lot of experiential aspects to it, where sometimes someone would come and wave their hand at a crowd and the entire crowd would fall over. A lot of times, and I said this to Jeff Kreipel recently, it's not that dissimilar than some CE5 events or Heist events in my mind. It's a very similar sense that something numinous, something ineffable is in our presence. We can invoke it, we can interact with it, and it will have physiological implications for how we live and what happens to us. And it's basically touching these two parts of reality together. So I think it's truly fascinating. And absolutely, we start getting into the deeper questions about the nature of reality itself, which we'll get to in just a minute. But before we go there, I want to bring in another aspect that I think, looking back, one doesn't expect is going to come in here. And this has to do with the occult and esoteric parallels. that get brought in. Because again, people go, wait a second, you guys lost me. We were talking about aliens and spaceships. What on earth does that have to do with the occult and esoteric parallels? But we know that there is an alignment between the UFO phenomena and ceremonial magic, for instance. Channeling comes in, theurgy, astral entities come in. So not just entities that are coming from elsewhere in the galaxy, but beings that exist on the astral plane. What is that? Is that the same thing as interdimensional, to your point about placeholders? Fascinating, right? And I think also about previous conversations we had on this podcast where I kind of picked up that you had a bit of a glaze left over, or a residue, if you will, from your Christian history in terms of how you thought about the occult. So how do you think about it now? What's different now? And how do you try to make sense of how somehow that's part of the same topic as this thing we call the UFO phenomenon?
All right, this one's a lot of fun. I'm trying to think where to onboard with this one. So my kids are watching Stranger Things right now. They're getting caught up before the new season kicks off. And in the last season of Stranger Things, there's a character on the show who's really into Dungeons and Dragons, and they talk about the satanic panic that happened in the 80s. And you remember this, and we grew up with this aspect in the 80s and maybe even the early 90s. It certainly was making its way through certain Christian circles, sort of the satanic aspects of rock and roll, for example. I mean, it was where Satan was kind of behind every corner. Satan was in Halloween, Satan was here and there. And so, in the time looking at that, I was conditioned to view these sorts of practices, these occult practices and viewpoints as, just completely foreign, not to be touched, stay away. They must be crazy. They've lost their sanity, they've lost their grip on reality. Meanwhile, I'm going to church services multiple times a week. I'm praying to an invisible being. I'm going through various rituals. I'm celebrating holidays. So where I'm going with this, I think you can see where I'm going with this, is that having enough distance from the trappings of the Christian tradition in my adulthood now, I look at it all kind of actually the same. It's all really on the same playing field. So when I go to a church service now, like with my parents or something, and I'm watching the minister do this or that and the congregation do this or that, I mean, I look at it from the very same perspective that I would view an occult ceremony, or having a seance or a mediumship circle, or it's a collective human enterprise designed to evoke a certain specific response and experience, and really to impact reality. Whether that is interior reality or exterior reality, it's designed to sort of impact the experience of reality. So I think it's really, really fascinating. It's absolutely part of this subject. It cannot be denied. Like, it is intricately involved with aspects of the phenomena, and the humans who have, sort of shunned the stigma and have pushed forward with these practices in light of that stigma to see how far they could move these boundaries. I think they're the ones that really should be applauded, because they recognize that it had some efficacy, like it actually does something. And so they kind of leaned all the way into that. And those of us who think they're crazy just continue to look on with baffled stares, but they're really discovering things about the nature of reality that we are unwilling to see. So it's really, really fascinating. And I don't think we do enough of it, quite frankly. We do it in a very soft way. If you're sort of non-religious, we're doing these things in a very soft way, not in quite as an overt way collectively. But I think we may want to really try to embrace that. Maybe the best example that I can think of might be going to a concert, right, where you're all going to have this experience, and you're singing the songs, and you're doing the dances, and you feel that energy shift that occurs in that moment. So it's kind of a proxy for some of these practices in my mind.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that one great example to bring to people's awareness here that speaks to this strange intersection that seems like strange bedfellows that wouldn't be in the same conversation, and yet is the character of Jack Parsons. So here's a guy who was early on one of the pioneers in the rocket program and was literally recruited to help develop our rocket program around that time where really consequential inventions were made. And he was cutting edge in terms of that and actually had a clearance at one point, although that got taken away at some point because of some of the consequences. But in addition to being a scientist and a great scientist on top of that and really understanding engineering and propulsion systems and all that, he also was a devotee of Aleister Crowley and was really interested in kind of magic and how we might be able to tap in, again, not in some sort of make-believe way, but as a kind of engineering, if you will, these other aspects of reality. And just like we use certain kinds of chemicals in a certain order to let a rocket take off, there's certain things you can do, invoke into the nature of reality itself that can change or pull out things from other aspects of reality. Now, again, from a physicalist point of view, that doesn't make any sense. People are like, I understand the chemical thing with the rocket. I don't understand what you're talking about other realities, right? But again, once you recognize that one of the things this most consequentially cancels out is physicalism as a possibility to make sense of reality at all. So what's fascinating here is that not only does someone like Jack Parsons believe you could do this, being a devotee of someone like Aleister Crowley, but then as you and I have talked about, you get people within the U.S. government, the Collins elite being the prime example, who actually were concerned that he was successful. They didn't say, oh, that guy's crazy, we can just dismiss him now. They thought, uh-oh, this guy has opened some sort of portal into some netherworld, some other domain that is referenced in religious history, maybe not perfectly, but still referenced in religious history. And by opening this portal, he's invited in, let something come in. And from this Collins elite perspective, speaking of satanic panic, basically the modern UFO phenomenon is just that it's a guise, it's a ruse. Really, it's these satanic figures, these demonic beings that have come in that are going to use this opportunity to basically rob people of their souls, which again, I just want to say, I was talking to you today about this really crazy book that's a really out there account that's out of print now, and it is called Masquerade of Angels, and it talks about some things to do with reptilian-like beings that, by the way, are one of the 4 types that were discussed in that interview with Dan Farah today, doing some things that on the surface certainly seem very similar to what we hear about in demonic kind of traditions. So not only do we have this notion that somehow UFOs are tied in with the occult, and interdimensional is speaking to this notion that there are different aspects of reality you can tap into, that space-time is hackable, but it's hackable beyond a materialist framework of what it actually is. This starts getting into the reality model question. We also have this notion of as above, so below, this notion that you can do things on the level of mind that will actually impact reality. This gets so interesting. At this point, you are deep in the weeds, but let's go even a little bit further. So from here, we get into the next stage, which is stage 6. And this one I'm going to call ontological inversion. And this speaks to something you said earlier. Because at this point, you've brought in so much, and it's flipped upside down so much of the script we inherited as modern people in the West, that the question is no longer what UFOs are, but what reality must be for them to occur, along with the occult and Jack Parsons and these different notions of beings that can fly. What is the nature of reality in which these kind of things can arise? And from this perspective, and this goes back to what you said earlier about when I first started talking to you about idealism, this sense that physical reality as we perceive it is emergent, not primary. This speaks to what I was saying in the most recent POC episode, this notion of the omnijective versus the objective or the subjective, this idea that there isn't an out there reality which we can just read and interact with but don't impact. We actually do impact it, and we're actually part of it. And every observer is constrained by every event, and every event is informed by every observer and the actions of that observer. So you have this very interactive, participatory kind of cosmos. Now, speaking of disclosure, in some ways, that would be the ultimate disclosure. And this relates back to what I was saying before about that being that was really sorrowful, recognizing that humankind had lost its way. And mainly the point it was making, I think, was, if I remember the quote correctly, we don't understand our own power, our own potential. And this speaks to this notion of being co-authors. Here we're into transpersonal psychology. We're into the notion of non-dual circles. So here we start going from physical entities that are not just necessarily extraterrestrial, but perhaps interdimensional, whatever that means. But even the notion that entities might be informational, symbolic, and yet real, archetypal, or even hyperdimensional. So speak to me about when you began to grapple with those kinds of notions.
I'm gonna date myself here as well. So remember the movie Wayne's World, right? And sort of that grunge era and the phrases that we would use in the 90s, and the word comes to mind. That's mental, man. So we use that phrase to sort of say like that's kind of brain breaking, and it's crazy, it's out there, it's mental. And I use that very intentionally because it really is ultimately mental. It's kind of, the reality is very, in a very real sense, dreamlike. It's interactive. We engage with it, and as you say, we observe and change it. It is changed by us. It's interrelational, and I think to adopt that perspective, which is funny because it's something you kind of think of initially as like, well, I have to kind of believe that in order for it to be true, but it is already true. Like, we're already doing it. We're just not necessarily as cognitively aware of the fact that we are doing it. The way in which we relate to the world, the perceptions that we have about it, the perceptions we have about ourselves and our friends and our dreams and our experiences, all these things occur within the realm of the mind. And the objects that you see that we call objects, they are just occurring in the realm of the mind. And so on some level, these beings are objectively real, but on another, they are subjectively real. Almost as you say, this omnijectivity, they are just as subjectively real as they are objectively real. So it's really a brain breaking. It's crazy to consider, and it throws into question notions like causality and the linear nature of time, of determinism versus free will. There's all these aspects that then get wrapped into this, and then if you take this perspective and apply it to some of the encounter stories that you hear with these entities, it does change your perception of what those encounters might represent. So they represent, they can be viewed from many different layers of interpretation. Each has a validity, each has a valid perspective, and should be used to examine that experience, as opposed to saying it was just an experience with a gray, with another being that came into your room. It's more than just that. It's going to always be more than just that. Just like your first kiss or whatever is more than just a physical contact with another person. So it's a lot to take in, and I think is probably one of the most critical foundational aspects of this entire thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where it gets the most dramatic, the most consequential, the most disorienting for sure. And to use my favorite word of all time, the most discombobulating. I think about when I went to one airport and there's a recombobulation area. This is where everyone needs one of those areas when we get to this point. Because here we start recognizing that, to your point, things are simultaneously, objectively, seemingly real. They're experientially real. This is something I've been saying recently. Rather than asking whether something's real or not, I think we're better to ask, is it experienceable or not? That's actually a much more helpful kind of question to ask. And so here, the phenomenon is interpreted as an interface or a teaching mechanism, ultimately. So yes, it represents beings from different species that have their own agendas, but it's also serving some sort of greater integrative kind of capacity as well. And so in that sense, contact can be seen as an inner/outer boundary dissolution. So it's funny because we think about two things meeting, but in many ways it's about the dissolution of the boundary that has separated them. And initially it comes across as highly strange because it's two reality frames that are very, very different. But over time, the nature of the interactions begins to break down that boundary, make it more and more porous until eventually you kind of have the emergence of a new kind of reality, which might very much be what is on the table ultimately here. And I think about even something that was referenced in the most recent telepathy tapes episode where they talked about plant telepathy. And I was talking to you about this at lunch today while I was eating my plant-based pizza. Because what's interesting here is that in the episode, they talk about basically someone would be suffering from some sort of illness, or they knew someone that was suffering from sort of illness, and a plant will communicate with them that if you use my leaves or this root and you prepare it this way, this will help that person. And one of the things I was saying to you is that, again, this comes down to perspective, because from one point of view, a being, an entity known as a plant, is communicating with an entity known as a human being. But again, from this deeper level, if you will, it's one aspect of the same being communicating with itself. So just like when we can feel indigestion and know that we need to do something to alleviate that, the plant is basically tuning into another part of this larger corporate body, which is the human being. And so again, this relates to what I was talking about in my most recent episode about the holographic universe, the sense that to some degree, any division we make and every division we make is arbitrary and is largely an abstraction. That we have to recognize that part of what is strange about the way this all fits and doesn't seem to fit very well has to do with the way we frame reality, not with the way we understand the phenomenon. Because this is also spoken to in our inappropriate, you could say, relationship with the planet that's kind of breaking down our relationship with the planet. All the geopolitical tension we just spoke about, right? The social tension in our country. All of this is arising from these arbitrary abstractions we keep insisting are real. So in a very real way, I think that this does represent, represents the potential for boundary dissolution, which is to say the emergence of a deeper, more holistic understanding of reality. And knowing again that the whole thing is interactive, that there's this omnijective aspect to it, then it makes complete sense to me that it's not just about some being trying to wake us up, but reality itself, and perhaps we at some other level are trying to remind ourselves, remember something, so that we will alleviate some of the problems that are ultimately just a local problem, part of one massive omnijective reality.
Yeah, you brought up the film at lunch today, Memento, and that I think comes to mind here with this explanation that those who aren't familiar with the film, there's this guy that has amnesia and every day kind of wakes up not knowing anything about what happened the day before. And so he leaves Post-it notes around, eventually kind of starts tattooing stuff on himself to remember who he is, right? So in the same way that you're describing, we being part of ultimate reality have left these little breadcrumbs, these aspects of what reality is scattered about the experience, and in our human experience have forgotten that we've done that, and we just kind of were bumping up against them and going, who put this UFO here? Where did it come from? What does it mean? Where it's really something that we are intricately involved and part and parcel with. So it's it really is brain breaking to think about the phenomena from this perspective. I think this could be one of the harder ones for people to really come to grips with, because it fronts us on many levels, right? You've got the folks that say, well, explain to me then, why we have evil in the world. Why is there so much trauma? Why would Source, introduce these things, these kinds of horrible experiences in the world? Why would we choose an incarnate experience to be a young person that was killed in a war, in a genocide? Why would we choose to be part of that? So you get these ethical dilemmas that are introduced, and I think on the face of those things, they are really challenging. They are difficult to swallow. Things like the Holocaust. How do you stomach that and reconcile that with a model like this? But there are different vantage points that can be used to look at all these experiences, the scope of human beauty and decay and everything in between, and see that there is value in that enterprise, and that there would be value to us having that lived experience as both the torturer and the tortured, right? There is some truth and deeper value to knowing both of those experiences, and then coming out of that outcome and saying, I would rather not be either of those. I'd rather choose a different path entirely, choose a path of love. So it's so complicated, and I think you and I feel very close to this, but it feels like it's really, really far away from flying saucers for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I have to go even a little bit further in terms of wrapping this up in a way that feels somewhat complete. Because to your point there, when we start asking questions about the Holocaust and sex trafficking of children and things that just seem so horrific, how could this ever be part of this deeper way that reality is trying to ultimately arrive at integration? Well, this reminds me of something that relates to the talk I gave at the Archives of the Impossible, because I was on a panel which was all about multidimensional ethics. You mentioned ethics a minute ago. And what this really comes down to is to make sense of the phenomenon and the nature of the interactions and abductions and hybridization and all of it. We have to not just think about it in terms of there's a gray that's a fixed thing and there's a human being that's a fixed thing. But we have to remember that, number one, I'm going to introduce a few different wrinkles here. Number one, the notion of pre-incarnation contracts, the notion that many people actually recover memories of choosing the events of their lives, including abductions, including trauma they experienced that somehow became the catalyst through which they gained some greater spiritual wisdom. And as the Dolores Cannon material will point out, from that other side, when you're in this seamless interconnected realm, you choose those things purposefully because they are the greatest vehicles for potential growth. And a comfortable life is seen as kind of waste of time. So we have that notion, first of all. And then we even have a very interesting notion where many people who began as abductees and might have had, in some cases, like I think about Susie Hansen here, decades of trauma and horror every time she was abducted. She would have this trauma. She would be worried about what's going to happen next. Then one day she began to recognize and remember that she knew these beings before she incarnated here. And then on top of that, this is the real kicker, hence the name of her book, The Dual Soul Connection, that she herself is both a gray and a human. So speaking of boundary dissolution, we have in one mind, right, an example in kind of a microcosm of what we're talking about here. All these divisions are to some degree illusory and arbitrary. And so what I think this gets to is not just that some abductees are hybrids, but that actually all of us are. And this speaks to what I brought up last time in our last episode with internal family systems and the notion that we're all composite beings, whether we've been through trauma or not. And this goes through every level. It's all the way up and all the way down. And so somehow, in that sense, yes, it's real that you can have two personas within one person, and one of those personas will be allergic to peanuts, really, and the other one won't be. That's physical. It's physiological. And yet, at the other hand, it's about some sort of mind identity shift, right? And so what that points to, and what all this points to, is things that are both real and symbolic. And so I think ultimately what this lands us at is the sense that the UFO phenomenon, and like today's conversation, stops being the subject and becomes a portal to a larger question around metaphysics. I think that's ultimately what disclosure is about. And to your point, we've got a long way to go.
We do indeed. It's a journey of a million steps. But it's a journey nonetheless. And I like journeys. I hope everybody else does. I hope if you've, had enough life experience, you realize there's a lot of value to that learning process that sometimes can be painful, right? Sometimes the best learning is in fact painful, and that may be the biggest catalyst for change. I'm very hopeful that this film will prompt new conversations in the space. I think we're going to retread some similar territory that we've been treading for many years here, but it's necessary that we do so. At the same time, I think we are going to begin incorporating some of these deeper aspects. When you start giving people permission to put this on the table, you're also giving the philosophers permission, you're giving the theologians permission, you're giving all these folks permission to come in and then ask all of these deeper what if kinds of questions that ultimately impact the ways in which we live in both subtle and significant ways. So I'm very hopeful and excited for that. I'd love to get folks' take on the film and on these developments. Darren, it's a lot of stuff to cover, and I feel like we do try to touch on a lot of these things in a recursive way to try to hit these points from different angles, but ultimately kind of make the same point. and look forward to the conversations that are going to come ahead. I think we're entering into some new territory. A new chapter has started. So fingers crossed, we'll hope for the best and keep our eyes on the skies here. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.